I still remember my first drive into Summerview Greens, a leafy suburban community in the United States, beckoning with banners proclaiming, "Where neighbors become family." Rows of tidy houses lined the winding streets, each with well-kept lawns and neat hedges. The day was warm, the breeze carrying a hint of lilac from nearby flower beds. Everything felt serene, just what I needed after decades of living in a bustling city. Yet, behind that tranquil surface, Summerview Greens hid tensions that would soon erupt around an unsuspecting target: the local senior care facilities that catered to older adults in the neighborhood. In this picture-perfect development, a single figure dominated the Homeowners Association, HOA Brenda Farnett, though almost everyone quietly called her Karen behind her back. She was a middle-aged woman, hair shaped into a perfect bob, and she seemed forever armed with a clipboard to note the slightest violations. With piercing eyes and a thin-lipped smile, Karen had a reputation for being overly aggressive and unwavering in her belief that she knew best. I, Amanda Lewis, was no ordinary new resident, though I seldom flaunted my job title. For years, I'd served as the National Director of Elder Care Advocacy, a federal role focusing on the protection, support, and rights of seniors across the country. I'd often traveled to Capitol Hill, lobbied for legislation ensuring proper funding for nursing homes, and oversaw investigations into senior care abuses. Summerview Greens looked like a great place to enjoy calmer weekends when I wasn't traveling for work. Little did I suspect that Karen's wrath would soon set her on a collision course with me, and that her target was the very population I'd sworn to protect: the seniors in our midst. Summerview Greens was unique in that it had not one, but two senior care facilities within its boundaries: Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables. They weren't large nursing homes, more like small, home-like residences providing daily assistance and companionship for older adults who needed some help but wanted to remain in a friendly, neighborhood setting. Families often chose Summerview Greens precisely because grandma or grandpa could be just around the corner from children, grandchildren, or longtime friends. I found it refreshing. Seniors didn't have to be tucked away in institutionalized facilities far from suburban life. Instead, they could stroll along quiet sidewalks, share in local holiday events, even meet neighbors at the small community center. Many residents liked having these older adults around, feeling it enriched Summerview Greens with a sense of generational continuity. However, I began hearing whispers that Karen disapproved of the senior homes. She claimed they lowered property values, or that they attracted outsiders coming to visit older relatives. Some neighbors dismissed her negativity, but others worried she might start a campaign to restrict or evict the facilities. My professional instincts twitched. If an HOA official was trying to close local senior care, they might run afoul of both moral decency and legal obligations, especially with me quietly living among them. At that stage, I had no concrete evidence, only rumors. But I resolved to keep an eye on the situation. After all, if Karen tried to meddle with these crucial senior services, I couldn't stand aside. My duty, both personal and professional, was to ensure older adults got the dignity and care they deserved. Summerview Greens might claim, "Where neighbors become family," but if Karen had her way, it could become a nightmare for the most vulnerable among us. Before the trouble began in earnest, I had a brief run-in with Karen. It happened on my third day in Summerview Greens. I was unloading groceries when she approached, wearing a pastel polo embroidered with the HOA logo. Her gaze swept over my driveway, lingering on a small stack of boxes I'd yet to bring inside. "Good afternoon," she said in a clipped tone. "I'm Brenda Farnett, though folks tend to call me Karen." She extended a hand with a brittle smile. "Treasurer of our Homeowners Association. We uphold standards here to keep Summerview Greens looking pristine." I forced a polite smile, shaking her hand. "Hi, I'm Amanda Lewis. Just moved in. Pleased to meet you." She nodded curtly. "We have some firm guidelines about storing personal items. Don't let those boxes sit out for long. The HOA expects a tidy curb appeal." I assured her I'd bring them in immediately. She gave a satisfied little nod. Then, letting her gaze wander to my house, she commented on the color of my front door. "It's a shade or two off the approved palette, dear." I swallowed annoyance, deciding not to challenge her just yet. A moment later, she turned the conversation to the senior facilities. "You might notice we have these so-called elderly homes integrated in the community. They can be quite disruptive: extra visitors, ambulances at odd hours, you understand. If you find them a nuisance, do inform me. Many of us would prefer Summerview Greens remain a quiet, upscale neighborhood without. She trailed off, sniffing disdainfully. My stomach clenched. So the rumors were true. She disliked older adults living in her precious domain. I kept my face neutral. I see. I'll keep that in mind, I said, though inwardly, I bristled at her scornful attitude. She patted my arm condescendingly, then marched off with her clipboard, presumably off to find other violations. I stared after her, unsettled yet resolved. My job had taught me that folks who see seniors as a nuisance can become dangerously aggressive. And Karen was obviously a woman who believed her authority trumped all else. Over the next few weeks, small but ominous signs suggested Karen was indeed targeting the senior facilities. Residents from Daffodil Court began complaining about new parking rules that restricted visitor vehicles to a distant lot, far from the facility entrance. This made it hard for families, especially those with limited mobility, to see their elderly relatives. The facility managers politely questioned the HOA's sudden changes, but Karen brushed them off, claiming, "We must control traffic for safety." Worse, Riverside Gables staff noticed yard maintenance inspections from the HOA almost daily. Karen or her proxies would appear, scolding them about the height of shrubbery or a leaf on the sidewalk, slapping them with random fines. It felt like harassment. Some staff whispered that Karen was trying to push them to the brink of compliance nightmares, hoping they'd pack up and leave. The seniors themselves began feeling uneasy. One woman, 80-year-old Gladys, confided to me while we strolled the community center's garden. "I moved here to stay close to my daughter, but now it feels like we're unwelcome. That Karen lady acts like we're intruders." Others recounted how Karen glared at them if they walked too slowly down the sidewalk, or asked them to keep indoors if they used walkers. The hostility was subtle yet oppressive. Concerned, I quietly reached out to the administrators of both Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables, introducing myself as a supportive neighbor with experience in elder care policies. Without fully revealing my national role, I offered to help them navigate the HOA's demands. They were grateful, but seemed worried. "We have limited resources, Ms. Lewis," said Ms. Morgan, the manager at Daffodil Court. "If the HOA escalates, we fear we might not be able to keep operating. The city's zoning rules allow us, but the HOA keeps piling on new regulations." In my mind, I resolved that if Karen went too far, I would leverage my official capacity. For now, I'd observe, gather evidence, and let the situation unfold. But I suspected a storm was coming. Karen's resentment for older adults was too intense to remain at small harassments alone. Sure enough, Karen escalated within a matter of days. A notice appeared in every resident's mailbox, titled, "New Summerview Greens Ordinances for Congregate Care Facilities." It declared that facilities hosting multiple older adults must adhere to stricter aesthetic and usage rules, including limitations on how many times an ambulance could be called per month, an absurd requirement, mandatory landscaping changes to blend in, and severe restrictions on visiting hours for relatives. The notice ended with a chilling line. Failure to comply could result in significant fines or revocation of community privileges. Essentially, Karen threatened to block the facilities from accessing shared roads or utilities if they didn't meet her impossible demands. Immediately, the staff at both homes panicked. These so-called ordinances had never been voted on by the full HOA membership. They seemed conjured by Karen alone, rubber-stamped perhaps by a few intimidated board members. Word of these new rules spread like wildfire. Concerned families visited the homes, outraged that their visiting times might be restricted or that emergency calls for seniors would be limited. Some parents who lived in Summerview Greens with older grandparents in these facilities threatened to protest. But Karen's intimidation factor was strong. She had a reputation for harassing anyone who stood up to her, issuing petty violation notices or imposing made-up fines. Recognizing the seriousness, I convened a discreet meeting at my home, inviting the managers of Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables plus a handful of sympathetic neighbors. We needed a plan. The managers looked exhausted and frightened. Ms. Morgan sighed. "If we can't comply, and Karen revokes access to local roads or water lines, how can we operate? She's effectively threatening to choke us out." One neighbor, a paralegal, pointed out that the HOA bylaws might not legally override county or state laws allowing these facilities. Another neighbor suggested we mount a signature drive to recall Karen from the board, but we all knew she had allies, or at least fearful neighbors who wouldn't cross her. I sat quietly, listening, aware that as a last resort, I had the power of the national elder care advocacy behind me. The question was, how far would Karen push us before we responded with full legal might? Behind the scenes, Karen applied more pressure. Staff at Daffodil Court discovered that their usual vendor for medical supplies refused to deliver inside Summerview Greens, citing new access limitations. The vendor explained that an HOA representative told them the roads were private, requiring special permits to deliver to certain addresses. Ms. Morgan tried to clarify, but the vendor was unwilling to get entangled in a potential dispute. This forced the staff to pick up supplies themselves, adding cost and inconvenience. At Riverside Gables, a nurse recounted how a local ambulance was delayed at the front gate one night. The security guard, newly hired by the HOA, demanded proof that they were authorized for multiple calls this month. The nurse was livid. An older resident nearly had a stroke while the guard debated if they exceeded the allowable ambulance limit. It was appalling. The nurse threatened to call the city's emergency services, but the guard claimed they were just following Karen's new policy. The staff member recognized that if a life was lost due to such a delay, it would be a tragedy. The tension soared. Families of the seniors were furious, some demanding meetings with the HOA. Karen dodged them, or if cornered, she spouted lines about community standards and overburdening resources. Fear for the elderly grew. If a medical crisis hit, would the facility's staff be obstructed? Meanwhile, the city's code seemed overshadowed by the HOA's more immediate local control. People whispered that the city government might intervene eventually, but Karen had strong local influence. At this point, my moral and professional lines had been crossed. This was no longer a minor nuisance or a typical HOA spat about paint colors. Older adults' health and safety were at stake. I decided to engage my network. Quietly, I placed calls to the Office of the Ombudsman for Senior Care, referencing the unusual developments in Summerview Greens. I also tapped a colleague who specialized in elder law, sending them copies of Karen's ordinances. If Karen thought she could unilaterally close down senior care homes, she was about to learn the power of federal and state regulations protecting these vital services. With each new harassment, resentment toward Karen swelled among the general membership of Summerview Greens. Some neighbors who'd stayed neutral or even passively supported her realized she was tormenting vulnerable seniors. The crisis reached a boiling point at the next HOA monthly meeting. The clubhouse was packed, an unusually large turnout. Everyone wanted answers. Karen presided at a folding table, flanked by a couple of board members who looked tense. She brandished her clipboard, calling the meeting to order. First, she rattled through standard items, landscaping budgets, a reminder about garbage bin placement. Then a hush fell as the new ordinances for congregate care facilities topped the main agenda. The room crackled with anticipation. Karen launched into a monologue about protecting Summerview Greens from undue burdens. She listed her complaints: increased traffic from visiting families, ambulances that disrupted the peace, older adults loitering on sidewalks. She concluded, therefore, the board enacted measures to ensure a safe, aesthetically pleasing environment. If these senior facilities can't comply, they'll have to leave. An outcry erupted. Ms. Morgan from Daffodil Court demanded, under what authority do you limit ambulances or cut off supply deliveries? Our license from the state. But Karen cut her off, retorting that the HOA had private roads. We have the right to determine who uses them, she declared. At that moment, I stood, voice loud and steady. Karen, you're violating multiple protections that ensure older adults have access to essential care. I know because I'm intimately involved with these regulations. In fact, I paused, looking her in the eye. I'm the National Director of Elder Care Advocacy. Gasps rippled across the room. Karen's eyes widened. I continued firmly. You have no legal right to restrict emergency services or block deliveries to licensed care facilities. If you persist, you'll face intervention from my agency and possibly the state. We will not let older adults be endangered. A stunned silence settled. Karen's cheeks reddened. She hissed, "You! How dare you keep that hidden? This is private property. Federal agencies can't meddle in our local affairs. I calmly replied, "We protect seniors' rights nationwide. That absolutely includes Summerview Greens. If you attempt to close these facilities, you'll meet direct legal consequences." Some neighbors cheered, others murmured in confusion. Karen tried to retort, but the mood had shifted dramatically. The meeting adjourned in chaos, with residents crowding me, relieved to have a champion. Karen stormed out, her aura of untouchable authority deeply shaken. I suspected she wouldn't back down easily, but she'd now face an opponent with the full force of elder care legislation behind me. After the explosive meeting, Karen's public stance faltered. She realized her intimidation might not break the senior facilities as easily as she hoped. Yet, like a wounded animal, she lashed out in more devious ways. Property violation notices. She flooded the mailboxes of anyone outspoken against her, citing obscure landscaping infractions or improper signage. A family that posted a "We Support Our Seniors" yard sign received a $200 fine for unapproved signage color. Threatening letters. Staff at Riverside Gables discovered typed anonymous letters, warning them to vacate or face bigger problems. The letters included references to building code inspections, again implying the facility might be forcibly shut. Malicious rumors. Karen spread claims that seniors at Daffodil Court had bed bug infestations, telling neighbors to keep their distance. The staff vehemently denied it, inviting county health inspectors who found no issues. But the rumor lingered, sowing suspicion. Meanwhile, I collaborated with the National Elder Care Office, finalizing a complaint stating that the HOA was violating older adults' rights. The agency prepared to send official letters. I also quietly connected with state officials who oversaw licensing of senior facilities. They assured me that if Karen forcibly obstructed them, the state would step in with legal mandates. In response, Karen branded me a federal bully, telling supporters that I sought to destroy local autonomy. She insisted the senior homes were a drain on resources, though she provided no evidence. Some naive neighbors believed her populist claims. Others turned on her, outraged that she'd stooped to lying about bed bugs and interfering with ambulances. Summerview Greens turned into a powder keg, with residents bitterly divided. But it was the seniors themselves, frail men and women who just wanted peace, who suffered the most. Ms. Morgan confided that a few more vulnerable residents were frightened by the ongoing hostility, worried they might be forced to move. As tension mounted, I braced for Karen's next big move, certain she wouldn't retreat gracefully. The final push came when Karen convinced the HOA board to hold a special vote on whether to allow commercial care operations to remain in Summerview Greens. She framed it as an official referendum on the presence of senior care homes within the neighborhood. This was obviously a ploy to legitimize her personal vendetta, but she had skillfully manipulated certain bylaws, claiming the facilities were non-residential businesses that needed the HOA's continued approval. On the day the special vote was announced, panic seized the staff at Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables. If the majority voted them out, backed by Karen's smear campaign, the HOA might forcibly terminate their local utility agreements or block road access, effectively shutting them down. Ms. Morgan called me, voice trembling. "This is it. Karen wants a mass vote to evict us. If she wins, we can't operate without a stable supply chain or emergency access." I assured her that any local vote contradicting state or federal elder care protections was unenforceable. "But we must be prepared," I said. "She can cause chaos, even if legally, she can't truly evict you." We decided to fight the propaganda war with facts. I organized a small coalition, staff from both facilities, sympathetic neighbors, even some adult children whose elderly parents resided in Summerview Greens. We printed fact sheets clarifying how crucial these care homes were, how older adults had a right to remain integrated in the community, and how the state licensing overshadowed any arbitrary HOA referendum. We distributed them door to door, holding peaceful gatherings explaining that a yes vote meant forcibly removing beloved seniors, while a no vote upheld compassion and the law. Karen responded with more scaremongering flyers. "Vote yes to remove risky senior facilities. Protect our neighborhood from overcrowding, extra traffic, and soaring insurance costs." She claimed the presence of older adults increased liability for the HOA, referencing phony statistics about accident rates. The entire neighborhood buzzed with tension. On the morning of the special vote, yard signs for both sides dotted lawns. Emotions ran high, shaping up to be a showdown pitting Karen's hateful zeal against the community's conscience. That Sunday afternoon, residents gathered at the community center to cast ballots. The turnout dwarfed even the biggest HOA elections in memory, each side urging every homeowner to show up. Karen stationed her loyalists at the entrance, handing out more misinformation. Meanwhile, volunteers from the senior facilities tried calmly explaining the stakes. Shutting down care homes would displace dozens of older adults, some in fragile health. I witnessed tense arguments outside. Some longtime residents wavered, not wanting to cross Karen, but also feeling guilty at the prospect of evicting seniors. Others marched in, determined to stand against her. I tried to keep an even keel, reminding folks that a local referendum couldn't override state or federal protections, but we still needed a strong statement of support. Finally, after hours of voting, the board tallied the results. The atmosphere crackled with suspense. Karen sat with folded arms, a smug expression, presumably expecting victory. Ms. Morgan and other staff from Daffodil Court stood pale, bracing for the worst. Then the board president read the outcome. Total ballots cast, 486. Yes, remove/close senior facilities, 201. No, allow them to remain, 285. A chorus of relieved cheers erupted from the no side. Karen's supporters gaped in disbelief. Ms. Morgan and the Riverside Gables staff wept tears of joy, hugging each other. At first, Karen simply stared at the board, stunned. Then, her face twisted in rage. She sprang to her feet, shouting, "This is rigged. They brought in outsiders to vote. I won't accept it." But the result was final. The majority had chosen to keep the senior care homes, reaffirming the community's moral and practical sense. A wave of relief washed over Summerview Greens. It seemed Karen's campaign to legally expel older adults had failed, or so we hoped. In the days following the vote, a sense of triumph spread among neighbors supportive of the seniors. They believed the crisis had peaked. Yet Karen refused to concede. With an air of desperation, she took an even more radical step, forging an official eviction notice from the HOA and sending it directly to the senior facilities by certified mail. The notice stated that Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables must vacate Summerview Greens within 30 days or face immediate property seizure and utility disconnection. When Ms. Morgan showed me the letter, I was astonished by its brazen illegality. The vote had contradicted any such measure. The letter bore a fake board resolution number and Karen's signature as treasurer. She was openly defying the democratic outcome. Not only that, but she invoked made-up legal language about community domain reversion. It reeked of desperation. I contacted the board president, who was horrified. He confirmed that no such eviction had been authorized. He confronted Karen, but she dismissed him, claiming she had executive power to act swiftly. Realizing the danger, he convened an emergency board meeting, where they formally declared Karen's eviction notice invalid. However, Karen refused to stand down, telling them she'd proceed with the eviction, board approval or not. At this juncture, I'd had enough. This was now a direct threat to forcibly displace older adults. That same day, I called my office in Washington, D.C., requesting the formal involvement of the National Elder Care Advocacy legal team. I also notified the county attorney, forwarding them the forged eviction letter. They agreed that if Karen tried to implement such an eviction, it would be a grave violation of multiple laws. Preparations began for immediate legal action, possibly including an injunction against Karen personally. Meanwhile, the senior facility staff and residents trembled at the thought of being forcibly cut off from water, electricity, or road access by the HOA. Ms. Morgan confided that some families were panicking, uncertain if they should move their loved ones to another city. The heartbreak was palpable. Karen's mania was turning Summerview Greens into a place of fear for its most vulnerable. I resolved that the day of her accountability was near. A week later, the county attorney's office responded swiftly to my pleas. They delivered a cease and desist order to the HOA, specifically naming Karen. The letter threatened immediate legal ramifications if she pursued the eviction of state-licensed care facilities. The county also notified local law enforcement, instructing them to intervene if Karen attempted to blockade roads or disrupt services. Karen, of course, raged about government overreach. She posted a tirade on the HOA's private forum, claiming powerful outside forces were meddling to destroy property rights. Some gullible neighbors echoed her rhetoric, but the majority saw how far she'd gone. The board distanced themselves, disclaiming that Karen acted alone in drafting the eviction letter. They apologized publicly to the senior facilities. Despite this official crackdown, Karen wouldn't surrender. Late one evening, a nurse at Riverside Gables found the facility's water supply abruptly shut off. Checking the external valve, they discovered a large lock installed. The nurse dialed 911. Police arrived to find Karen on site, brandishing a key. She insisted it was her right to shut off water to unauthorized tenants. The outraged officer explained she was in direct violation of the county's order. Karen was promptly cited and threatened with arrest if she repeated such acts. She spat in defiance, calling the police incompetent. For me, each new episode underscored that Karen's vendetta knew no bounds. But the final hammer was about to drop. My national office had prepared a lawsuit on behalf of the seniors, citing civil rights violations, elder abuse statutes, and property interference. If the local police citations didn't deter her, the lawsuit's weight certainly would. Soon, we present her with an ultimatum: either cease her tyranny or face a federal civil trial that could bankrupt her and land her in jail. In the midst of this legal storm, Summerview Greens remained on edge. The emergency hearing for the civil lawsuit arrived, scheduled in the county courthouse. The staff from both Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables, along with a group of affected families, filed into the courtroom. I joined them, armed with documentation from the National Elder Care Advocacy detailing Karen's repeated attempts to shut off essential services. The county attorney and the facility's lawyers sought an immediate injunction to protect the seniors. Karen arrived, defiant. She had hired an attorney to claim the HOA was well within its rights to discontinue business usage of residential roads. The judge listened to arguments from both sides. Our side presented stark evidence: the eviction notice, the sabotage of water supply, the ambulance blockages, the chaotic new ordinances. We emphasized the real harm to older adults, including near medical emergencies. The judge looked increasingly troubled. Karen's attorney tried painting the seniors as disruptive commercial ventures that the HOA had the right to remove. But the judge pointed out that both Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables were state-licensed, lawfully established, and crucial for vulnerable individuals. The judge also noted the contradictory results of the special vote, which Karen lost. Finally, the judge hammered down: it is outrageous that an HOA would unilaterally cut water to a care facility or limit ambulance access. Ms. Farnett, you are undermining public safety and well-established elder care rights. This court grants an immediate injunction preventing any interference with these facilities' operations. Karen stood rigid, lips pressed tight. The judge warned her that further violations would result in contempt charges. She stormed out, refusing interviews. For the seniors, it was a major relief. The injunction legally shielded them from Karen's direct sabotage. But I suspected the last confrontation was yet to come. Karen's fury was at a breaking point, and so was her risk of criminal liability if she pressed on. Shortly after the court's injunction, an uneasy calm settled. The staff at Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables exhaled, hoping Karen finally recognized she was outmatched. But I remained watchful. People like Karen rarely conceded gracefully. One stormy night, Ms. Morgan phoned me in a panic. The facility's alarm system indicated their generator had been tampered with. Daffodil Court relied on a backup generator for emergencies, especially essential for seniors with oxygen machines. She asked me to come quickly, suspecting Karen's involvement. When I arrived, a fierce rain drenched the sidewalks. The facility's exterior lights flickered ominously. Ms. Morgan led me to the small generator shed out back. We found the padlock broken, wires yanked from the generator's control panel, and diesel fuel lines cut. If a power outage hit now, the seniors would be vulnerable. Anger pulsed through me. Karen was openly defying a court order, endangering lives in a final sabotage attempt. We called the police. An officer arrived, scanning the scene with a flashlight. "This is sabotage again," he muttered grimly. Ms. Morgan pointed out footprints in the mud. We followed them behind a row of hedges. There, we glimpsed a shadowy figure, a woman in a soaked raincoat, fiddling with some tools. The officer shone his beam and shouted, "Freeze!" The figure tried to bolt, but the slick ground betrayed her. She stumbled, revealing her face under the hood. It was Karen. Caught red-handed, she shrieked at the officer, cursing him. "You have no right. This facility must be shut for the good of the neighborhood." She lashed out, but the officer quickly restrained her. Ms. Morgan and I stood in shock as Karen ranted about how the judge's injunction was meaningless. The policeman calmly read her Miranda rights. She was arrested on the spot, charged with violating the injunction, criminal trespass, and malicious destruction of property. This time, there would be no easy release. Karen's second arrest in a matter of weeks reverberated across Summerview Greens. The local news aired stories labeling her the HOA tyrant, who tried to forcibly evict senior facilities, now caught vandalizing their emergency generator. The contempt for her soared. Many neighbors, once fearful, expressed relief that she'd finally face serious legal consequences. The board promptly removed her from all positions, disclaiming any association with her actions. Freed from her overshadowing presence, the board recommitted to supporting the senior homes. Prosecutors wasted no time adding charges to her ongoing case. She faced potential jail time not only for ignoring the injunction, but also for endangering seniors reliant on life support equipment. The city's enforcement staff considered whether to forcibly seize her home to pay restitution for the damage she caused. Meanwhile, Ms. Morgan reported that staff and residents at Daffodil Court felt safer, though shaken. No one could fathom how hatred for older adults had driven Karen to such extremes. I, for my part, quietly informed my national office of the developments. They were prepared to testify or supply legal backing if the local prosecutors needed a federal angle. But it seemed the county had ample evidence to ensure Karen's severe punishment. Over the next month, we waited for her trial, certain that the outcome would set an example that you cannot target elder care with impunity. Karen's trial commenced under intense media scrutiny. The prosecutor laid out her pattern of harassment, blocking ambulances, forging eviction notices, cutting water lines, and culminating in sabotage of a generator that seniors depended on. They introduced testimonies from Ms. Morgan, facility staff, families of residents, and the local police. The judge also acknowledged the prior injunction Karen blatantly violated. Karen's defense argued she acted to preserve the neighborhood's standards, painting the facilities as commercial intrusions. But cross-examination by the prosecutor tore that argument apart, showing how her zeal led her to break the law repeatedly, endangering older adults. When Ms. Morgan testified, describing the fear seniors felt at the possibility of being forced out or left without emergency power, the jury listened with empathy. Some even wiped tears. The brutality of Karen's actions, targeting a vulnerable population, was undeniable. I took the stand as well, explaining my role as National Director of Elder Care Advocacy. The prosecutor asked me about the legal protections guaranteeing seniors the right to safe, accessible care. I outlined how Karen's sabotage threatened not just convenience, but actual lives. The judge nodded grimly. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated briefly. They returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts: criminal contempt, destruction of property, harassment, reckless endangerment, and others. The judge's condemnation was scathing, emphasizing how Karen's arrogance risked the lives of older adults. She was remanded to custody immediately, no bail, pending sentencing. Outside the courtroom, families embraced, relieved that justice would be served. Karen's sentencing hearing arrived. The judge, referencing the gravity of her crimes and the vulnerability of her targets, imposed a heavy punishment: 3 years in prison for the sabotage and repeated defiance of court orders. Substantial restitution to the senior facilities, covering legal fees, property damage, and the financial losses incurred by staff and families forced to adapt to her disruptions. Forfeiture of assets, including her Summerview Greens property, if necessary, to satisfy restitution. Permanent ban from holding any position of authority on a homeowners association board in the state. Karen sat, pale-faced, as the judge read the sentence. She tried to speak, but tears choked her. The final, humiliating blow was the court's formal condemnation of her gross disregard for the health, safety, and dignity of older adults. No friend or ally came to her side. She left in handcuffs, propelled by officers, her fate sealed. For Summerview Greens, this day marked the end of a harrowing chapter. The message was clear: systematically targeting senior care would carry dire consequences. A subdued sense of relief swept the neighborhood. Families no longer worried about hidden sabotage. The seniors at Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables felt truly secure for the first time in months. The entire community reevaluated how they treated each other, mindful never again to allow one tyrant to overshadow basic compassion. With Karen gone, the HOA leadership restructured. The new board, free from her intimidation, collaborated with me and the senior facility managers to rebuild goodwill. They rescinded all of Karen's bogus ordinances, replacing them with a formal policy that recognized the vital role of elder care. They hosted open houses at Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables, encouraging neighbors to meet the seniors, volunteer in activities, or simply share stories over coffee. To heal the rifts, Ms. Morgan organized a Grandparents' Day festival, inviting the entire community to celebrate older adults through games, crafts, and a potluck. Local children painted cheerful murals on the facility's fence, depicting intergenerational unity. The turnout was overwhelming. Even residents who once sat on the fence about the senior homes came to see how much they enriched Summerview Greens. I continued offering guidance when needed, though I planned to maintain a lower profile. After all, my primary job took me across the country, advocating for seniors in many contexts. But I was content to see Summerview Greens embracing a kinder, more inclusive spirit. The place truly began living up to the motto, where neighbors become family. As part of Karen's punishment, her property in Summerview Greens was eventually confiscated to help pay restitution. The property was put up for auction. A retired couple, who actually loved the idea of living near senior facilities, purchased the house. They quickly replaced the harsh, imposing fences Karen had installed with a welcoming front garden. Neighbors found it fitting that a couple appreciative of older adults took over Karen's old home, transforming it into a place of warmth. Some residents felt a pang of pity for Karen, imagining her locked away, presumably stewing in bitterness. But the memory of her cruelty toward the elderly overshadowed any sympathy. She had wielded her HOA power to degrade the dignity of seniors who just wanted a safe place to spend their twilight years near family. Her own downfall was a cautionary tale about what happens when personal vendettas turn into malicious abuse of authority. One breezy spring afternoon, Summerview Greens gathered in the communal garden for a new tradition, an Elders Appreciation Picnic. Families brought dishes, seniors from Daffodil Court and Riverside Gables mingled with neighbors. Laughter filled the air. Younger folks asked for advice from older folks, forging precious bonds across generations. The meltdown Karen caused now felt like a distant nightmare. If anything, it strengthened the community's resolve to protect and cherish its older members. I strolled through the crowd, exchanging warm greetings. Ms. Morgan approached, smiling. "We can't thank you enough, Ms. Lewis, for your guidance and for stepping in with the full weight of the law when we were desperate." I nodded, gratitude swelling. I'm glad I could help. But truly, the community pulled together. They rejected Karen's cruelty. That unity saved the day. She beamed, eyes glistening. We see it now. Without everyone's stand, who knows what horrors might have befallen these seniors. But now, look around. They're safe, happy, and part of our extended family. At that moment, an elderly resident ambled over to show me photos of her grandchildren, bragging how they'd visited the facility last weekend. The simple joy on her face reaffirmed why I fought so fiercely. Older adults deserved respect and belonging, not eviction or isolation. Summerview Greens had learned that lesson well. Meanwhile, Karen served her prison sentence, her property confiscated, her name forever tarnished by the memory of how she tried to ruin senior lives for her warped sense of community standards. Summerview Greens, on the other hand, blossomed into a beacon of intergenerational harmony, free at last from her tyranny. In the end, compassion and justice had prevailed, ensuring older adults could live with dignity in the neighborhood they called home.